I remember when I first stopped drinking alcohol, I would go out to these social gatherings, and it was intense in the moment. Like, I was really aware of everything that was going on. I would hear everybody's conversation all at once. I couldn't block out multiple conversations, and it was just a lot of stimulus. But I didn't really recognize it as overwhelming at the time. But what would happen is I would come home and I would binge, and then I would crash. And I started to notice this pattern of every time I try to go out and socially connect, it is followed by an episode of binge eating, a migraine, some pretty intense shutdown. And that's when I really started to understand, I think I have social anxiety. And that is what we're going to take a deep dive into today. Welcome to Trauma Rewired, the podcast that teaches you about your nervous system, how trauma lives in the body, and what you can do to heal. I'm your co host, Elizabeth Kristoff. I'm the founder of brainbase.com, an online community where we actually do all the practical tools that we talk about on this podcast to rehabilitate the nervous system and create capacity. And I'm also the founder of the Neuro-somatic Intelligence Coaching Certification.
I'm a neurosomatic psychedelic preparation and integration guide, and I bridge the worlds of neurosomatic intelligence into your plant healing spaces. I am so looking forward to exploring social anxiety today because it's just so relatable. And so I think we should begin with just like, what is social anxiety, big picture, what it is, and how do we identify with it? I think this is the most relatable of the CPTS distinguishing characteristics. I mean, I think a lot of people relate to this because we hear it all the time. It's the most easily identifiable for people because they say it, they claim it, and I mean, and I have social anxiety for sure, and all around can just get a little socially awkward. So I'm excited to even explore what that spectrum looks like today and dive into this. And so, big picture, it is a fear and discomfort in social situations. People with social anxiety experience excessive worry about being potentially embarrassed or humiliated, negatively evaluated by others. That is one that really speaks to me personally in my experience with social anxiety. And it can be identified by the physical experience of racing heart, sweating palms, bracing muscles, and that overall tension through the body. And it can also drive dissociation and overwhelm in social situations. And like all of the CPTS components, they live on a spectrum. And it can be a really intense fear that leads to big isolation on the back end. It could be a fear of public speaking. And overall could lead to avoiding social gatherings, avoiding your family, maybe even in those in that context. And it could also be the feelings of self-consciousness in everyday interactions, that overwhelm that comes from simple or broader social interactions. And just like Elizabeth was saying, there could come with afterwards this crash, this migraine, this pain, or a protective output because really it is so taxing and so stressful.
Yeah, and it's a little tricky, right? Like I was talking about a moment ago, sometimes we don't really know that we have social anxiety, but we can figure that out by looking at the outputs after we're in social situations. I might not feel in the moment like I might not be aware of the signals my body is sending me, the racing heart, the sweaty palms, the muscle tension, but afterwards I experience these maladaptive coping behaviors that I used to re-regulate because it was such an intense amount of stress when I was in the social situation. And that can look like a lot of different things for people, but it might be that you do these social engagements and you push past your capacity because you're not really aware of the stress. And then you come home and you find yourself social media scrolling, numbing out, needing to have like long periods of time where you feel pretty shut down, disconnected from your body. You might experience those physical outputs, like you were talking about the migraine, the pain, um, substance use. All of these things are the outputs of our nervous system trying to protect us because we've incurred that big social stress.
I think substance use in social situation is like you said, this is it. This is where people can find themselves. This is where I find myself and can still on that spectrum. And because I really relate to the fear and the judgment, the potential criticism, because my inner critic was doing that. My inner critic was so harsh. And so because of the things that I was saying to myself, I was worried that this is the really the way that I was being perceived, and that would really spin me out, that very loud and abusive inner critic woven into debilitating emotional flashbacks and dissociation. So social environments became really, they were really threatening, potentially because I was in these cycles of CPTS, and I would regulate myself by really abusing myself through substance use, whether that was food, alcohol, or cannabis. And you might identify with using substances to deal with anxiety in a social situation like alcohol or cannabis because the social threat is so stressful and dysregulating. Maybe you're not someone who identifies with being on the spectrum of panicking in social situations. I also really relate to that too, and just having like full on meltdowns. But you'll find yourself in those patterns of over drinking, over consuming really food, alcohol, cannabis. And if you are like me, how I was, I would regulate with one of these substances, even to have the courage to leave my home, my bedroom, my house, my closet. Even getting dressed was a full on overwhelming response for me. So I was regulating on the front end. I was regulating throughout the experience. And then I was regulating on the back end, just like Elizabeth highlighted. And that mostly is really when the food kicked in.
Yeah, and it gets really painful
Mm.
because I remember, when I did stop drinking and I didn't have that numbing to do through the experience, but I still really wanted social connection, and I'd lost a lot of my social connections that I had when I was drinking. And it was painful because I started to understand, like, I can't do these social things without coming home and having a migraine and having a binge and being shut down. So I started to really limit my social interaction because I didn't want to face the consequences on the back end. But that also sucked because I wanted the social connection. And it's just a difficult thing to navigate, and like you were talking about, it falls so much on a spectrum, and that is when we're talking about complex post-traumatic stress. There are several reasons why this is a distinguishing characteristic of CPTS, and that spectrum is a little bit more intense when we have this developmental trauma. Because one of the things is it's so linked, like you were just speaking to about the inner critic and toxic shame. uh, those feed into the social anxiety. It's linked to the other distinguishing characteristics of CPTS. And if you have these other two components, it makes social interaction a lot because you're in this state of hypervigilance and performance and perfectionism as you're in these social environments to secure attachment or to cover up that deep rooted shame beliefs of I'm not worthy or I'm bad. And carrying all of that gets really pulled up to the surface when you're in those social situations is a heavy stress load.
It is, and when you do take away a big numbing out, a big regulator like alcohol, because I can witness myself in those places now, and like I said, sometimes I can just be straight up so socially awkward, especially if I'm on the phone or I feel like there's an ending time of something and it's not like a comfortable silence. I'm just like, "Okay." Bye. Like, I and it's, like, so weird sometimes, and it just kind of comes from nowhere, but I think it is because I've lightened up so much on those maladaptive coping behaviors, and so then it just, like, I find myself, like, so weird sometimes.
Totally, totally. And then with CPTS, it's like not just is there that social awkwardness because everybody probably is socially awkward sometimes, but when you have CPTS, now there's all this rumination about that and what happened to the attachment bond and what does that mean about me? And there's a whole somatic response that happens in your body. And it just makes those little moments, those little awkward moments without having the tools to navigate that and the awareness and the altitude and all that good stuff that comes with understanding your CPTS more, it can make those little awkward exchanges really impactful.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting just the cascade and the interwovenness of everything that we're going to talk about today and as we've been through this CPTS series. And I think it's really important to talk about hypervigilance because I think that's a way that people could recognize themselves, but maybe they are not really, oh, it's not in their awareness quite yet. But hypervigilance is a heightened state of awareness where an individual is constantly assessing the potential threat in the surroundings. So it's like having this internal alarm system that is keeping you on high alert, even when there's no potential or immediate danger, right? It's the scanning of the room. It's watching all the elements. It's not being able to have your back to the crowd or to a door. It's looking at your escape routes, whether that's emotional or physical, right? Reading people's faces, trying to be one step ahead of the people that you're around just by reading their nervous systems and reading the room and the perceived threat that's going on. And so, one thing that we have to remember is that trauma changes our brain, right? The amygdala gets shaped differently and that it could get larger and more sensitive to threat, right? Stressors have a compounding effect that gives you less capacity to take in all of the stimulus and it makes you less resilient to the stress. And so with trauma comes an inherent feeling of not being safe, especially around a bunch of other people. If you are in a state of hypervigilance, there is a lot of stimulus to take in during social events. People, noises, the new environment itself is already a stressor. And so, if your system is perceiving a lot of threat with stimulus, it's going to get pushed into a trauma response. Every situation when you have CPTS is a big stress load, and you might not have great tools for processing that stress.
Yeah, I noticed it myself a lot in the auditory stimulus. Like I said, I can't stop myself from listening to every single conversation that's going on around me, and that's a lot of information to take in and try to make sense of and to process in my mind in addition to also the social threats that you were talking about, the trying to read everybody's facial expressions, make sure everybody else is okay. Man, it's just a lot of sensory coming in to the system. And there can be a lot of physiological reasons why that much stimulus coming into our nervous system is threatening. We've talked on here a lot about the stress bucket and how all of our sensory information is going into that stress bucket all the time. So when I'm hypersensitive to bringing in a bunch of stimulus, and maybe I have some deficits in my input systems that are compounding that stress, right? Maybe I have some sensory mismatch. My eyes and another sensory system, like the balance system in my inner ear, they aren't synced up. And that's really energy costly to my nervous system, just at a very physiological level, because my brain is always having to decide which one of these is right and needs that information to be able to generate predictions and produce an output and keep me alive. And so, if I'm going into these social situations with a highly sensitive nervous system, I'm hyper vigilant. So, I'm taking in all this information and I have these deficits that are compounding the stress all of the time, then the water level in that bucket is just escalating very, very quickly in a big social situation with all of that input. And so I'm going to naturally get pushed into protective outputs, the outputs that my brain produces to try to keep me safe in that moment, to try to get me to reduce the amount of stimulus coming in, like pain, like a migraine. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to lay down and I'm going to shut out all that social stimulus. It's going to be a dark, quiet room. And my survival mind is like, okay, now we're safe because that was too much. And so there's these deep physiological reasons why a lot of stress in a social situation could push us into protective outputs.
And there's another component of this, which is in the unique development of people's brains, and that some people are experiencing and uncovering and knowing now that you have a neurodivergence of some kind, right? I am coming into the knowledge and understanding that I have ADHD. And before, and this speaks to the threat bucket, before I always questioned it, and I just did not have the room in my bucket to accept and to think about that level of sensory processing, because like we're talking about, so much of social engagement, it is a sensory experience. And I'm so happy about my neuro work and my threat bucket overall baseline level lowering so that I can embody this new understanding of having ADHD and tackle it from the perspective of neurosomatic intelligence. And so this is from Janera Nuremberg's book, Divergent Mind. ADHD is not a deficit in attention, but rather a challenge of regulating it at will or on demand. And it's often that we have too much attention, just not at the socially accepted times and situations. So, whew, that validation I have experienced in that book is comparative to reading Pete Walker. And we all know that was big. So, let me share with you some of the overlapping components of ADHD and social anxiety. So, you could find that high stimulation is both exciting and confusing, which leads to feelings of overwhelm. Being overstimulated without realizing that and the not understanding of where those boundaries are in your nervous system with the level of stimulus that's coming through. People with ADHD find emotional regulation is difficult, and that adds to sensory overwhelm. It could lead to those meltdowns that we talked about earlier, sudden bouts of anger or frustration. And so, with me, I already have a heightened fight response because of the CPTS that I've experienced. And then one of the things that we've touched on today is that high sensitivity to criticism and judgment, which is also an experience for people with ADHD. And then we have that masking, that dysregulation through engaging in harmful behaviors, right? And so it's it's a sensory overload that is too much when a person is trying to hold together multiple threads of information under the expectation of this neurotypical context. And there's so many aspects to ADHD that I want to honor that we're not going to talk about right now, because we will be bringing this into season 4, because I'm someone who also relates to having a sensory processing disorder. And that is why this neuro work and this daily practice is so powerful.
Yeah, I'm so excited that we're really taking a deep dive into all of this in season 4 because there are so many overlaps and intersections between complex trauma and different types of neurodivergence. And even one just by starting to look at, like, did my brain develop differently because of my complex trauma, or was I just born that way? And then even if I was just born that way, there's a whole nother layer of trauma in a real physiological sense, because the world is overwhelming my nervous system beyond my capacity to cope. And that's really what the definition of trauma is, right? When we have an experience that overwhelms our nervous system beyond our ability to cope and positively adapt to that stress. And so, if I'm trying to move through the world with a neurodivergent brain and nervous system, that is another type of trauma, and then it gets woven in to the complex trauma, and so there's so much going on there that we're going to really dive into. But in this specific example with social anxiety, like you were talking about with ADHD, or with somebody who just has is identifies as a highly sensitive person, there's that same level of sensory overload that happens in a social situation. And then our nervous system may not have the skills or the capacity to regulate that stress, and it might not feel safe to do so. We don't have the emotional processing skills, or in the moment we don't feel like we can do the things that we need to stay regulated and safe in that moment. And so we end up in the maladaptive behaviors or the physical outputs that come when our system is trying to protect us from that overwhelm.
And right now on site, on the Brain Based Wellness membership site, we're exploring relational healing and have that series. So you can go to rewiretrial.com to start engaging with that series. And then we'll be moving on to what is CPTS and this series, and how Elizabeth and I have been resolving this in a journey of applied neuro, emotional processing and expressing, and somatic movement. So join us at Rewire Trial to get those 2 free weeks and explore this work for yourself.
Definitely.
So how let's talk about how social anxiety can be an emotional overwhelm, right? Because this is something that we talked about on the empath episode, because we've learned to take on so much of another person's emotional experience, whether that comes from misattunement in your primary developmental stages, or if you experienced emotional neglect, which is an ACE score, which we've recorded on previously. But I think of how many clients that I've worked with who talk about, as a child, they had to learn to attune to a parent who is dysregulated, or a caregiver who's dysregulated. And over the years of their adolescence, they end up being the one who's regulating the rest of the environment, or trying to regulate the rest of the environment. And they learn that if I act this way, then maybe my dad will be more calm. Or if I act this way, maybe my mom won't get so angry. And so they start to develop certain behaviors because you're the ones who have to regulate everybody else. And so for some, especially as they get older, they may adapt humor as a way to diffuse a situation or a physical activity. There could be perfectionism or fawning. There's all kinds of different options that the nervous system will reach for. And children need to have an adult or caregiver to be able to attune with in order to regulate their nervous systems, particularly up until the ages of 4, when we cannot self regulate. And when that gets inverted, I think that's a big driver of a lot of these CPTS survival modes. Because remember, we can redefine our 5 characteristics as survival modes, right? Those are the survival modes that we fall into. A young nervous system doesn't have that experience. It doesn't have the wisdom or the knowledge to be able to self-regulate itself. And so much less the whole rest of the room and the world at large, really, right? That's a big ask for a little nervous system. And so it can really create and pattern some very dysregulating behaviors to try to have to do that and to step into that role. When that happens in development, your amygdala, your hippocampus is in an altered state of function. Your HPA axis is activated. When all of that stuff is ramped up, the lens by which you see the world, it changes. Your memory encoding changes, and everything in the brain changes its function, right? You go into a totally different mode, in a totally different state of being. Being in an environment like that, or being in a state where you can't re-regulate and there's no one to help you, if the brain stays in survival mode, it's gonna develop in survival mode. And I think it naturally leads to a lot of these protective behaviors and stress responses.
Yeah, it's it's huge. when we're trying to take on the emotional regulation of everyone around us in order to stay safe. Like it really feels unsafe to let someone else have their own emotional experience, to be frustrated, to be disappointed when there's someone else in the space that doesn't feel comfortable. And we really dove into this in the empath episode about how that's a really that empathy is this beautiful human skill, but it also is something that needs to be worked with in order to let it be a real asset and not something that's chronically dysregulating ourselves. Because if through emotional neglect or maybe parentification, we have deeply learned to take on the responsibility of other people's emotions, again, for survival, for safety, well, it's just a lot of work. And I think about this client that I've worked with for a long time, and this has gotten much, much better with time. It used to be very debilitating. Any kind of social interaction, there was so much stress about how everybody else was going to be experiencing the event, especially if it was like an event in their home or, they love to have social gatherings, but it was the pressure that they put on themselves to make it enjoyable experience for everyone. There were real big outputs of pain, migraine, inflammation that would take them out for weeks at a time afterwards. And, we can just we really have to start to repattern that at the level of our nervous system so that we can go into these situations and have boundaries, emotional and energetic boundaries to let everybody else have their own experience. And this kind of brings us to attachment styles, right? Because all of season 3, we've explored why CPTS is at its root an attachment wound. And if the core wound is about social connection, and our deepest triggers are about being rejected, abandoned, or experiencing retaliation from other relationships when we express ourselves, then social threat is the biggest, deepest stress our system faces. Relationships with caregivers, remember, shape our individual attachment schema, and now in our life, our nervous system responds with reactivity and threat to social connection. And that doesn't just replay in our intimate relationships, it shows up in all connections. So our neuromatrix is shaped by our developmental experiences. And then as we interact in this whole web of human connection, we're now primed for an attachment that is protective, that perceives a lot of threat. And so inside of our body, at our physiology, we're experiencing a lot of stress. And as human beings, we just are not isolated. Part of being a human being is being in relationship. And that's the rub with complex trauma. Maintaining connection and relationship can be inherently dysregulating, like everything that we're talking about now, with a heavy increase in chronic stress, and you have a need for social connection and interaction. And those two forces come up against each other and lead to a lot of internal chaos, a lot of stress in the body. And that's a really important part of understanding CPTS.
Yeah, attachment schemas. So it's really fascinating. Let's explore anxious attachment for a moment. Like, let's dive into this. I know that, from our past episodes, we understand that attachment styles are fluid, that our nervous systems are fluid and can change, will change situationally, depending on what our brain thinks is the most adaptive in this moment, in this experience. And if you learned in early development that your primaries and the people around you are not safe, that people are unstable and unpredictable, you're going to be hypersensitive to the way that other nervous systems affect you. And in the case of anxious attachment, the mom's nervous system is dysregulated. She's dissociated. She shuts down. And when we're attuning, we are feeling that here, not here, here, not here. And then that translates into that anxious attachment. And so We're attached, we're not attached. We're like it's like having a foot in and out constantly with other nervous systems and in relationship. And so from development, we become really hypersensitive to other people's nervous systems. And now we're around a bunch of other people in a social situation. We're going to be hypersensitive to their nervous systems. And that's a lot for our nervous system. So let's say you lean into anxious attachment and then you're actually in a social situation. Um, Individuals with anxious attachment tend to be overly preoccupied with their relationships because they fear abandonment. They seek constant reassurance and worry about rejection. There's a heightened sensitivity. Anxiously attached individuals are hyper aware of social cues and potential threats. There's a big fear of rejection. They dread rejection or disapproval, leading to avoidance of social situations entirely. There's an overall negative self perception. There's anxious attachment fosters self doubt and negative self talk, and it fuels social anxiety. There's overthinking, ruminating about interactions, conversations. There's the anticipation of judgment or criticism. And then there's the overanalyzing, dissecting social interactions, magnifying the perceived mistakes that you have made, right? Because all of this gets internalized. I'm not worthy of this. I am not good enough. And I'm the one from development who learns that I'm the one who needs to change, not the environment or the people around me. And so this can lead you into a lot of overdoing, overgiving, and particularly self-abandoning, right? There's so many things in a social situation that are dysregulating and stressful. Um, so this isn't something that I particularly relate to, but it's something that I've seen in social situations, and that's when somebody gets aggressive. They get aggressive maybe because they are they're drinking a bunch of alcohol to regulate their nervous systems, and back to if people are the threat and you move into heightened states of activation when you're around people and regulating through alcohol, experiencing and trying to numb out that like faster breathing, that rapid heart rate, and all of that, because you're preparing to protect yourself, but you're protecting yourself from an activated sympathetic state of fight flight. But in this case, we're examining flight because the alcohol has had a cascading effect on the body. And if the person's already in a dissociative state with numbing properties of alcohol and living with repressed anger and rage, boom. I mean, you just have a recipe for disaster. And then when you put that same scenario into relationship and attachment, then you could also be experiencing those well worn pathways of that person as they are in relationship to you.
Whoo, I relate to that. Used to have a lot of rage that came out when I was drinking, and it was so repressed all the rest of my life. But then when I was in social situations or not, maybe just even by myself and I would drink, that would like open the door for all of that repressed rage to come out on myself or on other people. And it was not a good situation. When we're talking about attachment styles, we have the flip side of that, right? And again, attachment styles are fluid and we can have both and we can be disorganized, but there's also avoidant attachment style where we have a real reluctance to rely on others and a fear of emotional intimacy and a tendency to suppress emotions. And it's more of a pull back from the social connection rather than a move toward anxiously to try to secure the attachment. And so people with avoidant attachment can find it really challenging to open up and connect with others. You had a caregiver where it was not at all safe to connect with that nervous system. And they put too much responsibility, too much stress, too much on your little developing nervous system. And so it feels at a survival level unsafe to take on that kind of connection and intimacy with other people. And so in social situations, you are being asked to connect and engage with people. And it can lead to a really big flight response in the body of like, I got to get out of here. This is too much. It does not feel safe. Or you might just feel really socially awkward because you can't connect to people and isolated. And, I'm someone with pretty disorganized attachment. So I relate to anxious and I relate to avoidant. But, when I would do things in group situations, I really wanted to connect, but it also felt very unsafe. So I also really pulled back and was very quiet and reserved and removed from the situation. And I did often feel like I just wanted to get the hell out of there as fast as I could. And though at the same time, I would see all these other people connecting and I would want that experience. And a lot of times when I was in that group situation, I felt really isolated and left out because I didn't have the capacity to connect.
It's a lot. I mean, it's just a to be I think we're wired intuitively, right, for the safety of connection. That's a desire and to want that. And then to know or to not know that you have a brain that's not wired for safe connection and not understanding that, that is a really hard place to be in a nervous system. I mean, it really is. And thankfully attachment schema, your attachment, it can change. um it does change. I mean, it changes in relationship that you're in, but even within those nuances of each relationship, you can blanket change your attachment and the way that you attach to others. And all of this is made possible with where you are at in your capacity, right? We have to move within the capacity of our nervous systems for any change that we want to make, whether that's personal or social. And there is a need to repattern the nervous system response to social interaction. So, one of the things that I learned to do was dosing my social engagement, my social interaction. Now I know what the boundaries of my own nervous system are. I know where I'm starting to be overstimulated or overwhelmed by the environment, by the people, by the sounds, and just by the whole thing at large. And so what I'll do is I'll spend some time in the situation and then I will remove myself. And at that time, after I remove myself, I'll do some drills. I might push the wall. I might do a little emotional work, really minimum effective dose. And at that time, I'll decide, am I re engaging or am I done? Am I done with this? And then I might just go home and not experience the pushback on the back end of the food. And I don't want that. I don't want those stress loops in my body. And so it always comes down to the dosing and the regulation.
Yes, really critical in order to repattern to honor our capacity and work within that minimum effective dose because it it is possible to change our attachment schema like you were saying. And we want to just remember, and we've talked about that a lot in the season 3, the relational healing season, but to remember that our attachment schema are the lens. They're the like paradigm of how we see the world socially. It's the glasses that we're looking through. How do I perceive other people's behavior, their action, their intentions? And that's the interpretation part of how the nervous system works. Remember, we're always taking in information, we're interpreting it, and then we're generating an output. And this is the interpretation part. And then the behavior, the anxiety, the response, that's the output. And so with NSI, it's the input is the social stimulus, and then we have the interpretation, which is our attachment schema that decides safe or unsafe. And then we generate the output. And how our perception is then going to dictate what the response is. Does my brain decide safe or unsafe? And when we have complex trauma, it's this repeated exposure to lack of safety. We know that it's usually ongoing environmental or social lack of safety, and that happens frequently over and over again, especially during our development. So it's not just this one big thing, but it's really a repetitive pattern of unsafe behavior and unsafe environments. And so if we grow up in that type of environment, naturally, that's going to shape the lens of how we view social interactions. It's going to change our perception, not just of intimate connection or family relationships, but all relationships will be affected. And so the complex trauma is what has formed and informed my attachment schema. It's what's created my lens. And again, kind of going back to this idea of redefining CPTS as frequently occurring outputs. We have these 5 outputs, and the C just stands for chronic. It means that there are chronically occurring survival mechanisms that our system has learned to depend on, and that I'm going to use over and over and over again to try to protect myself socially. So, if I want to change those outputs, then looking at this through the lens of NSI, I have to start to change the inputs, how my system is taking in information about the world around me, and I have to start to change the interpretation. And then I can experience the new outputs.
And the new outputs, next week, you're going to be hearing our new exploration of what is self-abandonment. And that's what all of this is about, is we do this work so that we don't self-abandon, right? We don't only just have a relationship to the outside world, to the social environment and relationship. You have a relationship to yourself first and foremost. And everything, it always gets internalized and it always comes back onto the self. And so, what do we do about all of this? And this is about the daily nervous system practice. It's about lowering the threat in your overall bucket. It's about being here and listening, right? This is kind of the first part, is that maybe this is all just coming into your awareness. And then you're going to jump on site with us at rewiretrial.com and check out those 2 free weeks that we offer. Right now, we are in the middle of the relational healing series on the brain-based wellness side. I mentioned that before. And then it's CPTS series. And so if you are identifying with any or all of these distinguishing components and you have CPTS, then please join us for these special series that we're doing. And we really want to see you on site, rewiretrial.com.
Yeah, we really would love to see you there, because these class series started as a request from a listener who emailed me and was a member on the site and said, "Hey, you guys have been talking about relational health all of season 3. Could you do some classes specifically related to that?" And I thought, that is a brilliant idea. Let's teach the tools in practical application to repattern all of these things that we're talking about repatterning. So we have the whole relational healing series. It's in the on-demand library. You just click relational healing relationships and all the classes are recorded there. And now we have a class series on CPTS showing you guys the practical tools and the ways that we use somatic practices and nervous system tools to repattern. So you can just click on the on-demand library CPTS series and it's all there for you, and you can explore it all in your 2 free weeks trial at rewiretrial.com.
And this just highlights how much we really love hearing from you. So please keep reaching out to us. And you are just such a big part of the co-creation of Trauma Rewired and what we bring to you on the Brain-Based site. So thank you
Absolutely.
so much.
Thank you.
This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered medical or psychological advice. We often discuss lived experiences through traumatic events and sensitive topics that deal with complex developmental and systemic trauma that may be unsettling for some listeners. This podcast is not intended to replace professional medical advice. If you are in the United States and you or someone you know is struggling with their mental health and is in immediate danger, please call 911. For specific services relating to mental health, please see the full disclaimer in the show notes.